Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're taking a trip back to 1957 to explore a sci-fi classic with a truly unusual monster,
Oh, yeah.
the Monolith Monsters. And we've got a whole stack of sources, reviews, a film study guide,
Nice.
even an entry in a monster canon
Wow. Really going all out.
to figure out what makes this film tick.
I have to admit, I'm intrigued. What's so unusual about these monolith monsters?
Well, how about this for a premise? What if the monster wasn't some creature, but rocks?
Rocks, huh? That's a new one.
It really makes you rethink what even qualifies as a monster, right?
It does. As we dig into these sources, we'll see how the monolith monsters really plays with that idea, all while tapping into some of the anxieties of the time.
So picture this. You're in this quiet desert town, San Angelo, California.
Yeah, okay, I'm picturing it.
Life's pretty simple, the sun is shining, and then boom, a meteor crashes nearby,
Oh, no.
scattering these strange black fragments everywhere.
Sounds like something out of a comic book.
Right. And these fragments, they seem harmless at first.
Right, just ordinary rocks.
But when they come into contact with water, uh-oh, things take a turn.
What happens?
They start growing into these massive, towering black monoliths.
Growing rocks.
Yeah. And get this, they shatter and multiply too, like at an alarming rate.
Yeah, that's a bad landscaping day.
Seriously, but the film actually grounds this whole threat in a bit of science, which makes it even more unsettling.
Oh, really? So it's not just like random monster mayhem?
Nope, there's a reason behind the madness.
I like it when sci-fi movies do that. Makes it more believable.
Me too. So these monoliths, they absorb silicon.
Silicon.
Yeah, silicon. And you might be surprised to know it's a pretty crucial element for our bodies. When I first heard silicon, I thought, wait, isn't that what's in computer chips?
I can see why you'd think that. Silicon is definitely used in electronics, but it also plays a vital role in us humans.
Really?
It's what helps keep our tissues flexible.
Huh. Learn something new every day. So what happens when the monoliths start absorbing all this silicon? Does it, like, mess with computers?
That's the thing. It's not the computers we have to worry about. It's the people.
The people.
One of the sources describes it pretty chillingly. People exposed to these monoliths begin to petrify. They slowly turn to stone.
Oh, wow. That's terrifying.
It is. It's like something straight out of Greek mythology, but with a scientific twist. And that focus on the science behind the threat, even if it's simplified for the big screen, that's a real hallmark of 1950s sci-fi.
They were trying to make sense of the unknown through science.
Exactly. And speaking of classic sci-fi, the Monolith Monsters hits all those familiar 1950s tropes, don't you think?
Absolutely. We see those Cold War anxieties about extraterrestrial threats playing out.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Like, it's not just any meteor that crashes in San Angelo, it's one carrying these otherworldly, silicon-hungry rocks.
And of course, who steps up to save the day?
Scientists, right? Of course. They're the heroes using their knowledge and intellect to fight back against this unstoppable force. It's that classic science will prevail narrative, so prevalent in 1950s cinema, like a kind of reassurance in the face of uncertainty.
It makes sense. People were looking for answers, for hope.
And amidst all this scientific drama, we also get that heavy dose of small-town charm, so popular back then.
Oh, I love that. The small town facing the big, scary unknown.
Right. It's not just about the spectacle of these growing monoliths.
Hmm.
The film takes time to develop San Angelo and its inhabitants.
Adds that human touch. Makes it relatable.
Exactly. One reviewer even pointed out that the film goes beyond just focusing on the two lead scientists.
Really?
We get glimpses into the lives of the townspeople, the local reporter who's just hungry for a scoop, the geology professor, the police chief trying to keep everyone calm.
That's great. They're not just faceless background characters.
Not at all. They all add to the film's heart, make it feel more real. You're right there with them, experiencing the wonder, the fear, and ultimately the resilience of this small town facing this extraordinary threat.
And what about the special effects? From what I remember, they were pretty impressive for the time.
Oh, they definitely were, especially considering they were working on a tight budget.
Oh, I bet. So how do they make those monoliths look so, well, monstrous?
They used some pretty clever techniques, those towering monoliths.
Yeah.
They were actually balsa wood models.
Also would. Like the stuff they use for model airplanes.
The very same. They were meticulously painted black and pre-scored to break apart in a specific way.
That's so ingenious.
Yeah.
So low tech, but so effective.
Right. They really achieved a sense of scale and menace with really simple materials, and for the meteor crash, They recycled footage from another universal sci-fi film. It came from outer space.
Talk about resourceful filmmaking.
Right. They really put thought into creating those visuals, even without all the CGI magic we have today.
It sounds like they really knew how to stretch a dollar.
They did. And while the film delivers on the spectacle, some reviewers did point out that the pacing is pretty deliberate. It's not non-stop action.
More of a slow burn then, building the suspense.
Exactly. It takes its time to establish the characters, the setting, the scientific investigation, which might be why some found it a little padded compared to other sci-fi films of that era.
You know, I can see that, but I also appreciate a film that takes its time, lets the story breathe.
Me too. Plus, that slower pace allows for a more nuanced exploration of how the characters react to this bizarre threat.
Right. Imagine waking up one morning to find giant rocks growing in your backyard. I need some time to process that too.
Exactly. So it's like a slow-motion disaster movie with moments of humor, suspense.
Or maybe even a little romance.
Maybe. And all of this builds towards that moment when the scientists finally crack the case.
Yeah.
They figure out how to stop these monoliths.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat now. What's the secret weapon? Some top secret government technology.
Nope. Something far simpler, and something you probably have in your kitchen right now.
Let me think. Flour? Sugar? Baking soda?
Salt.
Salt, like table salt.
You got it. A simple saline solution can disrupt the monolith's growth.
Wow. Talk about an unexpected hero. It's like David and Goliath, except David's armed with a salt shaker. So how do they actually use the salt?
It involves a pretty dramatic climax. They have to dynamite a nearby dam to flood the salt flats and create a barrier against the advancing monoliths.
Wow, that's a high-stakes gamble.
It is. But the fate of San Angelo, and maybe even the world, hangs in the balance.
I bet those salt flats look pretty good to them at that point.
Oh, I'm sure. So these salt flats, initially seen as this wasteland, become humanity's unlikely savior.
Love it. It's a clever twist.
Yeah.
Makes you realize what we might consider useless could actually be our saving grace. But you know what I find really fascinating about the Monolith Monsters? It's not just a thrilling sci-fi adventure.
It's not.
It really gets you thinking about what it means to be a monster.
Oh, I see what you mean. Because these monoliths, they're not like a traditional villain.
Exactly. They're not driven by evil. They're
Right.
just reacting to their environment, which makes them a much different kind of antagonist.
Than, say, a giant radioactive lizard.
Exactly. They're almost like a force of nature.
Powerful and destructive, but not evil, per se.
Right. And that makes their threat even more unsettling. Because can we fear something that isn't actively trying to harm us?
It's a question that feels weirdly relevant today, don't you think?
I do.
Like, we face all sorts of threats that aren't driven by malice. Climate change, natural disasters.
That's a great connection. Just like the people of San Angelo had to figure out how to coexist with these monoliths.
We have to grapple with these forces shaving our planet, too.
Even if they aren't acting out of some evil intent, it's almost as if the Monolith Monsters, even though it's set back in 1957,
Yeah.
is tapping into some of our very modern anxieties. That fear and uncertainty can come from all sorts of places.
Not just from some easily identifiable villain.
And it makes you think, how do we respond to those threats? Do we panic? Or do we try to understand them?
Maybe even try to find ways to adapt.
Just like they did with those salt flats. Speaking of which, let's talk about the visuals a bit more.
Yeah.
We touched on their use of balsa wood models and recycled footage.
Right.
But what else stands out to you about the film's look?
Those scenes where the monoliths are slowly rising from the earth, shattering and multiplying, but they're beautiful, but terrifying at the same time.
Yes, they really nailed that sense of scale and wonder, especially for a film made back then. And they used techniques like stop-motion animation, which I can only imagine was pretty painstaking back in the 50s.
Stop motion. So they were moving those balsa wood models bit by bit, filming frame by frame.
Exactly. That must have taken some serious patience and attention to detail.
But the results speak for themselves.
They do.
Yeah.
Those scenes have a tactile quality you just don't get with CGI. And it's not just about making the monoliths look cool either. They use the visuals to reinforce the film's themes, like the contrast between the black monoliths and the bright desert.
Oh, that's a great point.
It's like a visual representation of this clash between the unknown and the familiar.
And those scenes where the monoliths are casting these long, ominous shadows over the town.
Oh yeah, those are great.
It's subtle but effective.
Definitely. It shows how this threat is looming over everyone's lives.
Those little touches, those visual metaphors, they really elevate this film.
Beyond your typical monster movie.
And don't forget the music.
Oh, the music is
It
fantastic.
adds so much to the suspense, to the emotional impact.
Absolutely. Those dramatic chords, the eerie sound effects
Yeah.
really help to build tension.
It's a classic example of how music can make a film that much more powerful.
Couldn't agree more.
So it's not just about the visuals
Yeah.
or the scientific ideas. The Monolith Monsters uses all these cinematic elements, the lighting, the music, the pacing, to really pull you into the story.
To make you feel what the characters are feeling. It's a film that engages your mind and your art. Speaking of engaging the mind, let's talk about the historical context for a moment.
Okay.
The Monolith Monsters was released in 1957, right in the middle of the Cold War. What do you think that atmosphere of fear and uncertainty might have added to the film?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll definitely explore further. So we were just talking about how the Monolith Monsters really goes beyond a typical monster movie.
It does.
It makes you stop and think about what makes something a monster to begin with.
Right. And one of our sources, this monster canon entry, poses this really interesting question. Does something have to be alive to be considered a monster? And the Monolith Monsters really pushes you to think about that. Because these monoliths, they're not some evil creature.
Not plotting world domination.
Not at all. They're not driven by malice or intent or anything like that. They're just reacting to their environment. Yeah.
Absorbing silicon, growing, shattering.
Exactly. That's just in their nature.
So it makes them a very different type of antagonist.
Right. Than, say, a giant radioactive lizard.
Or some scheming alien invader.
Right. So in a way, they're almost like, what? A force of nature.
Yeah, I see that. Powerful, destructive, but not necessarily evil.
Precisely. And that makes their threat even more unsettling, I think. Because it's not something you can reason with, you know?
Or fight in a conventional way.
It really raises that question. Can we actually fear something that isn't even trying to harm us?
It's a good question, and it feels surprisingly relevant today.
Doesn't it?
Like, we face so many threats that aren't driven by malice, but forces beyond our control. Climate change, natural disasters.
I see what you mean. It's a great connection. Just like those people in San Angelo had to find a way to like coexist with these monoliths. We have to learn to deal with these forces shaping our world too.
Even if those forces aren't acting out of some evil intent.
It's almost as if the Monolith Monsters, even though it was made back in 1957,
Yeah.
it's tapping into these very modern anxieties.
Yeah.
That fear and uncertainty can come from anywhere.
Not just from some villain you can easily point a finger at.
And it makes you wonder, how do we deal with those kinds of threats? Do we panic? Try to understand them,
Find ways to adapt.
just like they did with those salt flats. Speaking of which, let's go back to the visuals for a minute.
Yeah.
We talked about their clever use of those balsa wood models, the recycled footage.
Right, right.
But what else about how the film looks stands out to you?
Those scenes where the monoliths are just slowly rising from the earth,
Yeah.
shattering, multiplying.
So cool.
They're terrifying, but also kind of beautiful at the same time.
They really did achieve a sense of scale and wonder, especially for a film made in the 50s. They used techniques like stop-motion animation, too, which must have been incredibly time-consuming back then.
Stop motion.
Yeah, you know, where they're moving the models little by little, filming frame by frame.
Oh, right, right.
It must have taken so much patience, attention to detail.
Wow. The results really speak for themselves, though.
Absolutely. They do. Those scenes have this tactile quality you just don't get with CGI these days. And they didn't just use the visuals for spectacle, either. They use them to reinforce the film's themes, too.
Yeah.
Like that contrast between those stark black monoliths and the bright desert landscape.
Oh, that's a good point.
It's like a visual representation of this clash between the unknown and the familiar.
Right. And what about those scenes where the monoliths are casting those long, ominous shadows over the town?
Oh, those are great. So subtle but effective.
It really shows how this threat is just hanging over everybody.
Right. All these little visual metaphors, they really elevate the film.
Way beyond your typical monster movie.
Exactly. And we can't forget the music either.
Oh, yeah. The music is fantastic. It really adds to the suspense and to the emotional impact.
Absolutely. The dramatic chords, those eerie sound effects, they really help to build tension and create a sense of unease.
Classic example of how music can make a film that much more powerful.
Yeah, I agree. So it's not just about the visuals, the science.
Right?
The Monolith Monsters uses all these elements of cinema, The lighting, the music, the
To
pacing.
really draw you in.
Exactly. Make you feel like you're right there in San Angelo with them.
It's a film that engages your mind and your heart, both. Speaking of engaging the mind, let's switch gears for a minute and think about the historical context of the Monolith Monsters. It was released in 1957, right smack in the middle of the Cold War. What do you think all that tension and uncertainty added to how audiences saw the film?
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how audiences back in '57 experienced the Monolith Monsters.
Right. I mean, they were dealing with the very real threat of nuclear war.
All those anxieties.
Absolutely. And our sources definitely point out how, like so many sci-fi films from that time, the Monolith Monsters taps right into that. Right. Yeah. That whole threat of the unknown, these rocks from outer space, it's like a mirror of that Cold War fear.
That some outside force could just disrupt everything.
Totally. It's that us versus them idea,
But with, silicon-hungry rocks as the them.
which is a pretty unique enemy, even for sci-fi.
It is. But I think that's part of what makes the movie so interesting. It's not just about fighting a visible enemy. It's that fear of the unseen, the unpredictable.
And that would have resonated with people in the 50s.
Yeah, absolutely. They were living with that constant fear, not knowing what was coming next.
Yeah.
Just like the folks in San Angelo and those meteor fragments.
So it's almost like the Monolith Monsters is a metaphor for the Cold War itself.
Yeah, I see that. This unseen force, that potential for everything to just go boom.
But the film does offer some hope too, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, it does. It really leans on science as the answer.
Which reflects another big part of the Cold War, right? That belief in progress, human ingenuity.
Exactly. The scientists in the Monolith Monsters, they're the heroes. They use knowledge and logic to fight back.
Like it's saying, don't worry, science will save us.
Yeah. That would have been a comforting message at the time.
Right. Even with these existential threats, there's still hope. We can overcome anything as long as we use our brains.
And that focus on science ties into that whole idea of individual action. Community resilience, too. You see it throughout the film.
You mean how the people of San Angelo band together?
Yeah.
Cool.
They don't just wait for the government to fix everything. They use their own skills, their own resources to protect themselves.
Classic American self-reliance, coming together in the face of danger.
It's something the film really celebrates. And it's like a counterpoint to all that Cold War anxiety, isn't it?
Yeah, like, there are threats, sure, but if we work together...
We can handle it. Rely on each other.
So the Monolith Monsters isn't just a fun sci-fi flick. It's like a snapshot of that time. Those anxieties, those hopes, all wrapped up in one.
It really shows how powerful storytelling can be. To capture a moment in history like that. The Monolith Monsters entertains us, makes us think, and leaves us with, a deeper understanding of, well, everything. Ourselves, the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Monolith Monsters.
Hope you enjoyed the trip back to 1957.
We hope it's made you curious to check out this classic film and the era it came from. Maybe even add a pinch of salt to your next movie snack.
And as always, keep on digging. Explore those multiple perspectives. Keep asking those questions.
Because that's what it's all about.